All right, so we are being recorded. Thank you, Leah. Welcome, folks, to Web Archiving Technology, Tools, and Resources. This is part 1 of 3 in our Introduction to Web Archiving Texas webinar series. My name is Courtney Mumma, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Texas Digital Library, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Lauren Coe, Supervisor in the Software Development Unit at the University of North Texas Libraries, and Mark Phillips, Associate Dean for Digital Libraries there. And in fact, Mark Phillips had the idea for Web Archiving Texas, and so we are very excited to get this series started in the build-up to the Web Archiving Texas event at Baylor in November. So with that, I'll go ahead and dive in with just a brief orientation to Adobe Connect. So this is just to show you here in the top left, you'll see the attendees pod. So you'll see the hosts, myself and Leah, the presenters, Lauren and Mark, and then all of the participants listed. In the middle left, you'll see the chat pod. There you'll find the best place to put your questions, your comments, make sure that you send that to everyone where it's indicated there in that pod. You can also direct message individuals if you choose to do so. Feel free to put questions and comments there in the chat at any point during the webinar today, and we will be able to answer them at the end. We'll do our best to allow between 10 and 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And then at the bottom left, you'll see the download pod. So this is where we are able to share files with you. And so what you see there now are the Web Archiving Technology slides that we're presenting right now. You're free to download those. And we will also have the recording and those slides available to you in a week or so after they are closed captioned. Now I'm going to hand over to Mark Phillips. Take it away, Mark.
All right. Thanks for everybody for joining us. The first thing that we wanted to do was try to get some examples of why we're interested in doing web archiving. And I think that comes up in a lot of people's first interactions with the web as a medium that we were interested in preserving. And one of the things that I think is important to remember is that the web is this something that we interact with and that's integral to our day-to-day lives. Almost everything that we do has some component of the web. Most of us in higher education, the university's website, our library's website, the content that people are interacting with almost entirely is web-based. There has been shifts in moving to app-based work where people are interacting with their phones, but even within that, they're still almost always interacting at some level with the web. And that is not only true in higher education, but when we look at organizations in general, they're making their reports, they're making their primary communication with their constituents available through the web. And so it's important to make sure that we are accounting for the web when we're thinking about creating library collections that will be useful to our researchers and our users in the future. And so the framing that I always like to think of is how will we be able to look back at this time and talk about it without the record of the web present in that discussion. And so let me page forward. There we go. Ian Milligan up at the University of Waterloo, who has done a lot of work in this area. I really love this slide. His discussion on a lot of this is like, how could one study and do history about the 1990s or the 2000s and not talk about the web, and not only talk about it, but have it be an integral place, a piece of their research. And I think that as we continue to move forward and as the distance starts to grow between the 1990s and the present, we're going to see more interest in looking at the historical web, and we're really going to start to appreciate the fact that some people started to collect it, and then we're seeing that it's going to be valuable in our own personal collections. One example of this, I think that speaks to a number of us that were alive at this point and working with the web, is the GeoCities work. That is an online community that was one of the first places where just anybody could have a GeoCities page. I had a GeoCities page. Everyone that I knew had a GeoCities page, and they were all pretty worthless. I was in college at the point, and we didn't really have a whole lot to say out there. But there was a lot of really interesting content that was made available on GeoCities, and there were over 1 million users in the late 1990s. That whole website got sold a number of times, and it was when it was at Yahoo, it was pulled from the web and not available anymore. Luckily, we had a lot of interest from groups like the Internet Archive, who helped us archive that content. But if they hadn't, it would be lost. And sometimes you say, well, it's just a place where people, put their personal blogs and personal websites, and why does that really matter? But it's really interesting to see how it actually gets used in the literature. So if you're just thinking about kind of like a scholarly communications sort of mindset, this is actually an example of a report that we have in the UNT Digital Library, A Minimalist Approach to Design of Walking Robots. It was published in 2002 from San Diego National Labs. And in the references, number 3, you'll see that's a GeoCities site. So if you're going through and trying to better understand this report and you want to follow these links, those GeoCities URLs no longer work as they were expected. And broken links aren't a new thing to most of us, but just thinking about the value of those. And when we look more into our digital collections, here at UNT, we have 38 theses and dissertations that reference GeoCities. We have 1,244 issues of newspaper issues that reference some GeoCities.com URLs. And then we also have 46 state and federal reports that all reference GeoCities as a domain as part of either their reference section or as examples within the content. So it's not only something that was kind of this ephemeral piece, but it actually became kind of a small little stepping stone in the kind of the scientific community, or at least in communicating about things that were available on the web. And one of it does have to be noted that there are a lot of fun things on the old web, and this URL, which you can go ahead and click in your browser, should take you to a site that's run by the Internet Archive. They went through the GeoCities site and they extracted all the GIFs and made a search engine, so you can go through and search. This example we have is searching for Texas, and you'll get a crazy number of GIFs that have some sort of relation to Texas, maybe based on their names, the file names, and then content that was related to it on the web pages. So there's a lot of fun that you can unearth through web archives, and it's not only for the serious scholarly communications side of things, but it serves many roles. One other example that I wanted to talk about was an example of a collaboration that there are certain things that can only be accomplished when multiple groups get together to work on them. And I think the web, archiving portions of the web, archiving the web as a whole is a great example of that. There is no one institution that can do all of it. We all stand kind of in awe at what the Internet Archive can do and the massive amounts that they have, but they don't even have everything. And there are many, many web archives around the world doing web archiving for their individual countries, for more topical collections, for event-based collections. So it's just something to remember that all of us working together will make a better product of a reusable web archive in the future. And the example I want to give is the end-of-term web archive that UNT's had the pleasure of working with for the past 3 terms. We started working with this in 2008 when there was the transition from the Bush to the Obama White House, and then we did an interterm, so the 2012, and then we finally did a set of crawls for the 2016 switch from Obama to Trump. And it allowed multiple institutions, including the Library of Congress, the Internet Archive, the California Digital Library. We all combined resources, both technical resources and also just people time, to acquire a set of websites we were interested in capturing, making those available to the partners for replication so that there's multiple copies of this across the United States, and making it then available to the end users. And there are, I've included the URL, which is eotarchive.cdlib.org on this slide. This is an example of a thing that wouldn't have been done otherwise. It's not anyone's specific mandate in the federal government to archive the entirety of the .gov domain. And so this is something that we put on to ourselves as a task, and we did the best we could, and we're starting to see more and more use of the collection as time goes forward, and people are interested in understanding not only the look and feel and the communication style of different administrations, but then also to just be able to link into, as URLs became more prominent in scientific literature or just literature in general, people can actually go through and get access to those so that we're not just having to slam against dead links. But one of the things that I think is really challenging about the web space is something that is true of all kind of technology heavy infrastructures, which is just the terms and the terminology and the jargon. And we're going to have Courtney take us through some of the jargon and some of the definitions that you're going to hear a lot as we move through these webinars and then move into the Web Archiving Texas event in November. So I'm going to pass it over to Courtney, and she'll take it from here.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, so Mark got the fun stuff, and I'm going to walk you through some definitions and some jargon so everything going forward is clear to you. So we're going to start with just defining web archiving itself in its many variations. So of course a website is one or more web pages, and then web archiving is the process of selecting, capturing, saving, and making accessible select content available online. I've noted here that we'll define capturing a little bit later in a future slide. A web archive then is that archived web content, those websites, and a web archive is a group of those web published materials that are collected, managed, and then made accessible. A URI is something that you'll hear pretty frequently too. It's a uniform resource identifier. It's the most common type being, of course, a URL by which a document can be uniquely identified. So let's break down the jargon. So you'll hear capture and harvest and crawl quite a bit. All of those terms in general mean downloading those files that make up a website, including things like the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, and the images in order to facilitate reproducing that website offline. You'll also hear a crawler, a spider, a robot. All of those are software that collects web content. So a crawler does the crawl, does the capture, a spider crawls, a robot crawls, captures, harvests, etc. And then what they capture, what they end up creating, is a WARC. So a WARC, W-A-R-C, is the ISO standard file format for storing web archived content. And it's a concatenation of records consisting of downloaded web files. So again, those HTML, CSS, images, etc. that I mentioned before, HTTP response and request headers, and then some metadata. And that format is something that extended from Internet Archive's archive format, ARC format, originally. Some more common terms you'll hear as you get more into the nitty-gritty of web archiving, especially if you're using particular tools. First, we'll start with seed or seed URL. So that's any URL that one explicitly directs that crawler to capture. And then those seeds and the scope of the crawl are based on the factors like domain matching, URI pattern, content type size, and they determine what goes into the collection. And then hops You'll hear this pretty frequently. This is how many levels of length the crawler ventures from a seed. So an example we provided here is that a crawl starting with the seed http tdl.org, the main site of the Texas Digital Library, that follows that page's link to its events page has gone one hop. A domain is a hierarchical name specifying a location that can be looked up in a domain name system, also called a domain name. And then the DNS, or domain name system, is that hierarchical naming system, most notably used to translate domain names to IP addresses for locating resources on the web. Of course, many of you are familiar with the fact that domains contain subdomains, and we've given an example here. TDL.org, for instance, is a subdomain excuse me, of TDL.org, and TDL.org is a subdomain of org. So top-level domain, or TLD, you'll see that pretty frequently. It's the last and most broad level of a domain, such as .com, .edu, or .gov, like that org that I just mentioned in the example below. And getting even deeper here, you'll see the word SERT pretty frequently. SERT, or S-U-R-T, is sort-friendly URI reordering transform. It's not the clearest of terms. All it is a way of representing URIs from left to right so that you can keep them together. So that TDL.org stays associated with blog.tdl.org, whereas if it was alphabetical, blog would be up towards the top and TDL would be at the end. You see here in this scheme that we've indicated that the reordering in the CERT allows you to keep those together. CDX, or CDX index, is a format for indexing individual web documents and URIs that are part of a web archive. So those are used pretty frequently for lookups by different access tools, which we'll get into in detail a little bit later in the webinar. And finally, regex, or regular expressions. You've probably seen these in other contexts as well. They use strings of characters, literal and special, to establish patterns to be matched against, again, often in access and search. So we have an example for you here, again, using that events part of the TDL site. And now I'm going to hand off to Lauren, who's going to walk us through lots of different tools and technology.
Okay, hello everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. So I'm going to get started with capture tools and tech. Seems like my turn came up very fast, but I guess that's good because I have a lot to cover, but you may all just be looking at GIF cities still. So, but anyway, so generally to get started in creating a web archive, you start with capturing a piece of the web and write it to work files, which Courtney was just describing. And here you can see an example of what a work file looks like. This is actually just part of one work record in a work file. It's kind of separated into 3 blocks or sections or chunks, with the first section being work fields that are defined in that work ISO standard that describe what's in that record. So for here we have a work type of a response. Those are the types of records that have like the money content, like the HTML and the CSS files, not just metadata or request headers, but the actual response from the server. You can see the work target URI is the URL I crawled. So this was a work that I generated crawling tdl.org. That second block there is the actual HTTP response headers that came back from the server, so those get put into the record. And then that third chunk, it's very much cut off, but that is like the beginning of the actual HTML content. Okay, so how do you actually capture the web? We use crawlers or robots, spiders, to capture the web. Basically, start out making a request for a seed document via a URI. So you if you want to capture an HTML page, you put in your URL to an HTML page. The crawler goes in, it gets that, it makes a request, it gets back the content. So if you put in a request for an HTML page, you get the HTML code, and the crawler is going to look at that and parse out other URIs from it. So it might look at A tags or image locations, JavaScript URLs, things that it might need to use to render the page. And then the crawler is going to determine, based on the scope that you've configured your crawler to run with, whether or not to add those additional URIs to the queue of documents that should be crawled and added to the web archive. That's kind of the most traditional method that a crawler is going to use. It's pretty fast and efficient, but it does miss some content. So another way of capturing that is getting used maybe more now, or in addition, a crawler will similarly make a request for a document that's specified. So if it's a HTML, it will make the request, it gets the HTML source code, and rather than just parsing only the code, it'll actually render the page in a browser, and it can be configured to do interactions with the page. So it might do scrolling or trigger other events, and it will actually record all of the HTTP requests and responses to the work file. So like an example, if you load a Twitter page with one of these crawlers, it'll load it in the browser, and it will tell it to keep scrolling through all of them, so all the tweets get loaded, which if you were doing this with the traditional crawling, all of the tweets wouldn't get triggered, and they wouldn't get added to your web archive. So this method gives you higher fidelity with your capture. You're getting a more true representation, but it's a lot slower and more resource intensive, and it's not needed for every type of page. But a lot of the times people building web archives will use multiple methods, like both of these methods, with a broader crawler and then one that's more specific for sites that need more detail. And that's like what Archive It does. It'll use different types of crawling to get the best capture. What crawlers can you use to capture? One of the big ones that's been around for a while is Heritrix. That's an open source crawler, Java-based, from the Internet Archive. It's been around quite a while. It doesn't execute scripts or JavaScripts. It's not going to do that scrolling, but it's fast, and you can use it for just large-scale crawling. You can see an image there I've included of what it looks like when you're running a crawl in Heritrix 3. The interface is pretty basic looking. The configuration is by an XML file, so you control the crawler settings and the scope of what you want to capture just with blocks of XML, so you've really got to read documentation and kind of understand what you're doing to use Heritrix directly. So you can actually use Heritrix not directly. There are other services that make use of Heritrix as an underlying tool, but build more user-friendly features on top of that. So Archive It uses Heritrix as one of its crawlers. That's a subscription service of the Internet Archive. And that user interface is going to help with curating, preserving, crawling, and quality assurance of your web collections. If you don't want to subscribe to a service, there are other tools out there, such as the Web Curator tool, which is an open source tool developed by the National Library of New Zealand and the National Library of Netherlands, that builds functionality on top of Heritrix that aid in managing permissions. I believe that's permissions like some national libraries, depending on their laws, have to get permission before they can archive websites, so this will help manage those permissions, and it also helps with scheduling, scoping, and again quality assurance. If you don't want to use Heritrix, there are still many other tools, a few of them, wget, it's a tool that existed probably long before web archiving as a thing. It's a tool to use at the command line for downloading web content. It has a lot of options, and now it includes writing to work files. So there you can see an example of a wget command that you could copy and paste into a command line, and that says to download the tdl.org homepage, save it to a work file called tdl.work, and the page requisites flag says to also get all of those embeds that are needed to render that TDL homepage later, so all the CSS images and things will also be captured. Browser is a tool developed by the Internet Archive with ArchiveIt for use for ArchiveIt users. It's a crawler that kind of works with that second method I was talking about, where it doesn't just look at the source code, but it actually loads HTML in a browser. It interacts with the page based on configured behaviors and writes everything to work files, so you get a much fuller capture on some of those harder to archive sites. And then Webrecorder is a free or subscription. You can do it free, you don't even have to have an account, or you can subscribe to their online service, or they also offer desktop software now for capturing the web. It's more for smaller scale, user-driven capture, so it's great for personal archiving, where a user views a website, they click around, and all of the request and response traffic is written to the work files as work records. More on Webrecorder as an example, because I think it's one of the lowest barrier tools to getting started in web archiving, because it is a hosted service. You can see in that image, webrecorder.io. You can just go there, you get this form. You can enter a URL like tdl.org and click on Start. And then it will open up that page in a browser, and it will, you can see there at the top left, it has like a capturing with the red record icon by it. It's actually everything it's loading in that browser is getting written to a work file. As the user clicks around, that'll all get recorded. So any page that they visit on this website will get recorded to a work. If they don't click on parts of the site, it won't get recorded to the work, but everything that they are looking at should get recorded. And those works can then be downloaded later for your own use. Do whatever you want with them. And let's see. And now social media capture tools and tech. So this is kind of carried on from the crawling section. It's I give it its own little subsection, because for a long time, social media capture was something that was commonly talked about as very problematic for institutions trying to do web archiving, because of the interaction that needs to happen with the site for content to be loaded, where things rely on JavaScript or page scrolling. You can see here, here's the UNT's main Facebook page that's been crawled with Heritrix and is now being played back in OpenWayback, which we'll talk about later. But you can see, maybe you can see, it's very small, but there's a See More button on there. And if you click on it in the web archive, nothing happens. And that's because probably a combination of things didn't get captured, and in replay, things don't run the same way. So that is why social media can cause extra capture considerations. But Webrecorder and Browser, which have already been mentioned, they do work better than Heritrix for social media capture, because they do record all of the HTTP traffic while a user automated interaction navigate a site. And there are, I just wanted to mention, there are other tools for kind of archiving some content from the web that are not in the same kind of type of crawler. Twerk is one. It's specifically for capturing Twitter content in JSON from the Twitter's API. So if you have researchers who are interested in tweets from Twitter, but they don't necessarily need the web page presence and CSS and stuff, there are tools out there specifically for helping to capture content from specific platforms. Now on to quality assessment tools and tech, often referred to as QA or quality analysis. So once we've captured web for our web archive, we want to know if we captured what we wanted. So one form of doing QA is manual QA. It's possibly the most used just because there is very low barrier to doing this. You don't need special necessarily infrastructure beyond what you've already got for capturing and serving your web archives. And in this, it kind of consists of taking your web archive, like your web archive content, putting it in a browser for display, clicking around, and noting problems that need to be addressed, possibly with further crawling. Of course, this is very time-consuming and doesn't scale. So UNT, who doesn't do or does a very relatively low amount of crawling compared to someone like the Internet Archive, may be able to use this. But for larger institutions that are crawling a lot, it's not really too feasible. This is just an example of a spreadsheet that we've used for our manual QA where we crawl a website. This one was Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, where we record any problems that we found in our archive, and then we'll have another sheet in the spreadsheet that has a list of all the URLs we want to add to a patch crawl. Semi-automated QA, so obviously, like we said, that it's very time-consuming to do manual QA. Archive it QA basically does similar to what I was mentioning in manual QA, but with automating a lot of it. So you can click in your Archive It account on a seed URL to load it in Wayback, and you'll get kind of what you see as a cropped image on the left there, where you have the website loaded in their Wayback machine, and there's a banner, and it'll say Enable QA, and you can click on it, and then it will take all the URLs that it detects as not having been captured, and it'll list them in the interface, and you can decide if you wanted to add them to a patch crawl or not. So it similarly is loading the web archive content in a browser, and then letting you decide if you want to crawl it, but it takes a lot of the work out of it. But it does still take user interaction, so there is, some work being done in how to better automate QA. One route that institutions look at towards working towards this, they'll use Heritrix or crawl logs and reports. So for instance, Heritrix writes a crawl log. You can see a couple line examples of what a crawl log looks like. It'll have like a timestamp, an HTTP status code, size of a document, the URL, MIME types, etc. Of all of the URLs that the crawler looks at. Heritrix also provides reports at the end of a crawl on numbers of hosts, MIME types, HTTP status codes, etc. So you can use these reports and logs to look for things like URLs that you thought you should have archived that don't appear to be there, or if they have unexpected status codes, or if there are big chunks of strange patterns of URLs you didn't mean to capture. These things can help with QA. Another route that institutions are taking with QA is analyzing screenshots. So after doing a crawl, they can automate loading seed URLs or other URLs that they're interested in a browser and automate taking a screenshot of it. So they could then, open up a folder of all of these screenshots, and someone could just eyeball the images to look for glaring errors. And here I have an example of the TDL page. On the left, you can't even really recognize it because I have it without having captured the CSS and images, so it looks very broken. versus what it should have looked like. So some institutions will take a screenshot at crawl time and save it, and then they can compare it to the result that they got afterwards and could then automate, if this image is not similar to this other image, to flag it for further review. Okay, so that's generally QA. Access, playback tools, and tech. So we've mentioned access and replay already. Access, playback, replay, they're all terms used interchangeably for pertaining to viewing archived web pages after capture. So you saw earlier that we're writing all of our web archives to work files, which aren't very user-friendly as far as viewing later. So we need access software to read records from work files and play back or display pages in a browser so that it's like looking at a live website, even though it's from the archive. So generally the way this works is the access software will look up a URI in an index, often a CDX, to determine which work file the HTML page or other document they're looking for is in, and then they do another lookup to find out where that work file is so that they can pull out the content and show it in the browser. And then the software also needs to be able to pull supplemental content. So if it's an HTML page, it also needs to be able to load all the CSS images, etc., in order to render that page. Issues with access in web archives. Web archiving is often not perfect. I liked earlier when Mark mentioned did the best we could as far as crawling the federal gov sites. So it's kind of cut off. So problems with this, there are problems both on the capture side and the replay side. So assets may not have been captured, so the CSS, the embeds like in that TDL example I showed where it was missing content needed to render it properly, and that could happen because your crawler scope was too limited, or maybe a server was down at crawl time and the URLs weren't available for capture. They're also in replay lookup leaks, so the replay software should like when rendering an HTML page, you want it to go and pull all of the CSS and images and JavaScript needed to render that page from the archive, but depending on the software and what it's doing, it might accidentally leak to the live web and pull a document from there, and so you won't get the true representation of the archived website as it is, as you have it. Search boxes and forms also don't work in archived pages because when you're archiving in the ways I mentioned, you have no back-end scripts from these website servers. You don't have their databases. So interactive things like searching aren't going to work. And video replay is often also an issue where you may have captured a video, but it doesn't replay in the page just because of the way things like YouTube, they don't put a hard-coded MP4 link in a page. So it's difficult for replay software to kind of paste back together a page and get the video embedded there. Some tools for viewing web archives. Some of them run as a server that you can host and then people all over can access them via the web. SolrWayback from originally the Internet Archive, now supported by the International Internet Preservation Consortium, is one of these web servers that you can use to view ARCs and works in a browser. PyWB or Python Wayback is a Python-based web application to do the same, basically. Replay is going to be different because it's a different implementation. This is from the people who do Webrecorder, and so it's higher fidelity. It does a little better, probably, in most cases. But there are also tools for viewing work files that don't rely on a web server. So Webrecorder Player and Webrecorder Desktop, coming from the Webrecorder people, obviously. They use PyWayback to help replay pages, but you don't need a web server, so you can view works on your desktop more easily. Ooh, I'm using up so much time. Getting close. And here's an example of the UNT homepage from 2011 in Open Wayback. So it basically just looks like you're looking at a live website, but there's an indicator here, this banner, that shows that you are in a web archive. And I wanted to point out, because we talked about issues, you can kind of see on this Find Us on Facebook thing, there's actually an issue in this where something didn't render properly or didn't capture right. On to search tools quickly. So we know about access tools now, but how do you know what to access in them? We have URL search. Pretty much any web archive is going to provide this to allow you to look up an exact URL. Other services that you may be able to do, like a URL starts with, or the Internet Archive provides like terms, terms that appear in the URL. So there are a couple examples there you can try later. But of course, people want full text search, which is a challenge for many web archives for a number of reasons. Complexity of content with all sorts of different file types out there on the web, dealing with duplication, the scale of content when you're archiving a lot of the web, and the cost of hardware to provide timely search results. But some institutions do this. Have some examples here of some of those that you can look at later. That either have just a basic search box, or Archive It has a little bit richer search form for more specific searching. There are also open source tools out there to help you with setting up full text indexing. Web Archive Discovery there is the one that the UK Web Archive uses for helping index to Solr. SolrWayback also uses Web Archive Discovery. And as the last thing, want to look a little more at SolrWayback. So this is something, because UNT hasn't yet implemented full text search, but I've seen them present SolrWayback in a webinar, and so getting ready for this one, I was like, wonder how much it takes to set up full text search for this. So I took one of our recent crawls, it was about 45 gigabytes. I downloaded the SolrWayback software, followed a brief section of their instructions in their README, which just had me move a couple config files to my home directory, put works in a directory that the README said, copy and paste some scripts, and then magically I've got this full text search of my collection. This was the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. You can see, like where I mentioned duplication, like the first and third one look very similar, but you can full text search and you have some facets, and you also have a Solr interface. But on to the last text section on preservation, and Mark is actually going to take you through this one.
All right. So one of the challenges I think a lot of us have, in addition to all of the challenges kind of with technology that Lauren highlighted there, is also dealing with preservation. And one of the things that's important to know is that the web archiving services that many of us use, there are some market leaders in this space. The Internet Archive and Archive It are great services. The Webrecorder, things like that, are really designed around capturing and playback of content, but they are not at all designed to be preservation systems for our web. And it's important for us to think about bringing that content locally into our libraries, into our organizations, and preserving that so that we can make sure it's the effort we're putting into this work today is still viable in 5, 10, 20 years. And so in the 2015 survey that Archive It did of their users, only 80% of their users had not taken a copy of their content. So they had done web archiving, but they had never acquired a copy of their content to locally preserve in their repository. And that's something that I think all of us really want to improve. And I think that's one of the things that we're hoping that can come out of some of these discussions of Web Archiving Texas, is to make sure that Texas can be a leader in this space, so that we're making sure that we're preserving this content in a better way. And so I think there's actually two things that really need to be talked about in dealing with this. The first is actually getting a copy of the content. Some of the different services that you might use, depending on the size and the scale of your operation, may give you an option of shipping you a hard drive with the web archive, or that may have been agreed upon in your contract. But most of them really make it available through download and expect you to interact with it from that point. And there are some tools that have been developed in the past few years. First, it started with a set of APIs that were created as part of an IMLS grant called WASAPI, Web Archiving Systems APIs. And it established a set of APIs for acquiring WARCs from a service like the Archive.it service. And once there was an API that was written, then it was possible for us to create tools that will help kind of programmatically make it a lot easier to interact with that. And one of those is the Pi WASAPI client that's linked to from this slide. And that's a Python tool that can be downloaded and used on the command line to programmatically acquire website or basically accounts from Archive.it if you have the proper credentials for your account. So that's a way to get that content locally. Another thing that's really important and is to have conversations with the various folks in your institution about bringing in web content. Web archives generally require a ton of storage space, and they often don't align with data models that we have for a number of digital repositories. So it's important to have a conversation with your IT systems administrators so that it's understood how the storage is going to be needed, what storage will be needed for the content. And you also need to have an understanding of how WARC files are managed within your whatever digital preservation plans you have, and how you're thinking about the web content. And then finally, understanding how WARC files themselves are handled within the systems. Certain preservation workflows and systems like Archivematica, Preservica, or Islandora have some processing of WARC files, and they understand that file format. Others, like DSpace and other digital library platforms will often just treat it as a kind of a binary file that doesn't know what to do with it, but it can at least preserve the bits and move that forward. So it's important to understand what kinds of processes can happen within your preservation environment. And I think that does that for the preservation side, and we'll pass it on to Courtney to wrap things up.
Thanks, Mark and Lauren. Y'all, please start typing your questions if you have them in the chat so that we have time to get to them. And I just want to show you a few things that we've done. First of all, TDL, with the help of Mark and Lauren and some other folks on our planning team for Web Archiving Texas, have pulled together a very brief list of resources in our Confluence site. And so there's a link here that you can use to visit that. Where you can learn a lot more about web archiving if you're new to it. I also want to remind you that there are 2 more parts to this webinar series that will provide context and background for the topics that we will be discussing at the upcoming Web Archiving Texas 19 event on November 6th at Baylor. The next 2 presentations will cover something we're calling the Web Archiving Sampler, which is looking at actual examples of web archives from Texas institutions. That's actually next Thursday, September 5th at 1 p.m. And then the next one after that will be the Web Archiving in the Library, Policies, Procedures, and Program Integration, and that's October 22nd. We'll paste that link in the chat window, and it has more information about registration. So if you haven't yet, just a reminder to please register for those webinars, which are precursors to our Baylor event. The Baylor event itself, a reminder, it is absolutely free. There'll be a link in the chat to our event page that has more information about all the logistics, lodging, transportation information, as well as the link to register for that. Again, it is free, and we've still got plenty of space left, so please do take this opportunity to go ahead and register for Web Archiving Texas. The goal of the event is to build a community around web archiving in Texas, bringing all of us together to share our skills and resources and amplify the work that impacts the national and international web archiving community. So again, that's at Baylor, November 6th. Finally, I want to assign a little bit of homework that we'll touch on at the beginning of the next webinar and maybe get some questions from y'all. We want to encourage you to do two things. One, try Webrecorder. So go to the Webrecorder site and go ahead and just create a work file and save it. Again, it's free, so please have at it. The second suggestion for homework is try something in the command line if you're comfortable with it. Use wget, which we mentioned earlier, that wget, and also create a work file there and save it. And we'd love to hear back from you about your experiences during the next webinar. So if you have questions, we've got 10 minutes remaining. Thanks so much, Lauren and Mark, for keeping on time and for packing this chock full of information. You may have noticed some glitches in our slides. Adobe Connect did something strange to them at the last minute, but you'll notice that the download pod has our slides there, and they look as they should when you download them. So feel free to grab those, and you can get all the links that we've provided in those slides as well. So we'll wait here just a few minutes to see if there are any questions in chat, and if not, we might go early. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm just going to assume that means that Mark and Lauren were just so incredibly thorough today that everyone is completely clear now on the basics of web archiving. Please do join us for the next two in the series and register for the Web Archiving Texas event at Baylor. And I will talk with you all again next week, hopefully. Take care. Thank you very much for joining us today.